Welcome back to This Week in Immigration. I'm your host, Hanadi Jordan, Communications Coordinator at the Bipartisan Policy Center. I'm thrilled to announce that this is the 150th episode for This Week in Immigration. If you've been a longtime listener, we thank you for sticking around with us all this time. And if you're a new listener, we thank you as well, and we hope you'll tune in for future episodes. Today, we'll be covering some recent immigration legislation that's been making the headlines, the Dignity Act. We'll be breaking down this bill in the next half hour, and joining this week regular Theresa Cardinal Brown as our guest for today, Representative Maria Salazar, the sponsor of the bill herself. Following our conversation with Representative Salazar, Theresa and I are going to take a look back on the journey this podcast has taken to get to this special milestone with some memorable clips from previous episodes. Stay tuned.
Immigration is one of the most divisive issues we tackle at the Bipartisan Policy Center. Given the polarized nature of today's political climate, it's not surprising that there's been a lack of successful immigration bills in Congress recently. It has been difficult to garner bipartisan support on immigration, and in fact, most of the legislation introduced on immigration in the last several years has not had any bipartisan co-sponsors. So when we see a sweeping, comprehensive immigration bill introduced with sponsors from both parties, we at the BPC take notice. Such was the case with the Dignity Act, introduced earlier this year by Maria Salazar, Republican of Florida, and Veronica Escobar, Democrat of Texas. And we are very honored today to welcome to This Week in Immigration Representative Salazar to tell us about this bill. Representative Salazar was first elected to Congress in 2020, and she serves Florida's 27th congressional district. She currently sits on the House Committee on Foreign Affairs as well as the House Committee on Small Business. Representative Salazar is also a 5-time Emmy Award-winning journalist for her reports on Nicaragua, Cuba, and the Dominican Republic for every major Spanish-language broadcasting network. So, Congresswoman, welcome to This Week in Immigration.
Of course, thank you. Wonderful to be with you. Such an important topic.
Yeah, so we're all very excited to hear more about the Dignity Act. But before we get into the meat of the bill, we want to hear about what sparked your interest in immigration and how it has impacted your life. So can you tell us a bit more about what lies behind your passion for this issue area personally as well as politically?
Well, as you said, I worked for Spanish television for 35 years. I'm one of the founders of Univision and Telemundo. So the people who are going to be benefited by this bill, or some of the people, were my viewers. We're talking about that group of class of illegals or undocumented who have been in this country for decades. They're doing their jobs that other people would not be doing and contributing to the American economy. So I know them well. I also now, when we came to Congress, we understood that immigration is the most divisive and toxic topic on the floor. So since I come from Florida District 27, which is the ultimate melting pot, I decided that maybe we are the people designed or best suited to tackle this very difficult topic. So that's why we created the Dignity Act, which is a complete immigration reform.
So you spoke a little bit about your work on the television programs and your audience. Can you talk a little bit about that early career and why it shapes your current role as a representative? You reported on the countries a lot of these people come from, right?
Yeah, sure. I've been to every single Latin American country more than once. Every one of them more than once. So I know the difference between the Ecuadorians and the Peruvians and the Nicaraguans and the Dominicans and the Puerto Ricans and the Bolivians and the Chileans. I know the difference. I know what they're thinking. I know what they want. And I do know that dignity is basically what that regular illegal who's been in the country for 15 years wants, which is to live a dignified life in the promised land, because the United States is still the promised land for so many of us. And my parents are the perfect example. Cuban Americans fled the Castro Revolution, came to the United States, and we love the American system. And that's why we want to preserve it. And we know that no country that respects itself can have open borders. So that's why dignity secures the border tightly, first and foremost. We put order in the house, basically. That's what we do.
Yeah. So let's talk about the Dignity Act now. It's a bipartisan bill that was introduced in May of this year, but you also introduced a version of the bill in the last Congress that didn't get any Democrats on board. Can you tell us more about the evolution of this bill? What was the bill you introduced last Congress, and what has changed since you started working with Representative Escobar?
Well, we've perfected it. I have a fantastic team of people who have been thinking about it along with myself for 3 years. And now we have the best product available. One of the first things we did was to go back to past Congresses and look for those provisions within the immigration area that have passed. Mm-hmm. So we put them, I always say that I did a smoothie. I got from here, from here, put it together, put it in the blender, and did a shake or smoothie. And that's what we did. And we're tackling or we're touching upon every area that needs to be corrected or improved when it comes to the immigration space. So the dignity, number one, seals the border. That's the first thing we need to do. We cannot have the scandal, child sex traffickers, the terrorists, the coyotes, the drug dealers coming in, and plus people that we don't know who they are. Number one, so you seal the border. Number two, you end catch and release. The asylum system has been gamed by those who do not know what other path they can come in through. So we fix that, and we give asylum to those who merit it. So we end catch and release. We enforce E-Verify. Now the business owners, the public sector will not need to hire anyone that is undocumented, because you're going to have millions of hands available to you. There's no path to citizenship for 1 year until it's certified that the border is secured, this is one of the main issues within the GOP, is that people do not believe that if we give any type of a status to the people who are in, the border is not going to be secured. So it's like the chicken and the egg. It's like, which one comes first? Yeah. So we seal the border, and for 1 year needs to be sealed. And then we give the dignity status, which I will explain to you what that is.
Yeah.
And at the same time, this whole project will be paid by those undocumented. Zero money from the taxpayers. Why? Because I do know, and then I go back to my background, I do know that those people that I served who are undocumented, they don't have any problems in paying a fine for being here and for staying here. Mm-hmm. And if we multiply $5,000 times 10 million or 11 or 12, we create a very big bucket of money. That's $45 billion that could be used for for technology to secure the border. So the math adds up. And then we do the Dignity Act, which is to bring out of the shadows those who are undocumented. So if you have been here, let's say that you are Pepe Perez. You've been here for 17 years and you are undocumented. You come out of the shadows. You have been here for more than 5 years. You do not have a criminal record. No gangs, murders, wife beaters, none of that. If you don't have a criminal record and you have behaved well and you have helped the country, and so we bring you out of the shadows and we give you the dignity status. And that is that you can go home for Christmas, go home to bury your mom, you can have a dignified job, you can pay taxes, you can buy your house, no government programs, you buy your own health insurance, and then you can stay in the dignity status forever if you want to. But if you decide that you really, really, really want to become an American, then you go into redemption. And that is that you pay another $5,000, you learn some English, you do some civic work, and then you go to the back of the line. And you know something? To those millions and millions of illegals, that is a pretty good proposition, because they do not necessarily want the famous path to citizenship. They want to live a dignified life in the promised land.
Yeah. So you've described the dignity program, and I believe the bill also does allow those that want to proceed from that program to a path to citizenship. There's an option there as well. Can you tell us a
That's
little bit about
redemption.
that? Yeah.
That's the redemption. Then after 7 years, you go into the redemption path. You pay another $5,000. You do some civic work. You learn English. You fill out more papers. And then you go to the back of the line of your country.
Okay.
So I mean, you may have to wait another 3, 4, 7 years. I'm sure they won't mind, because you have the dignity status. Right now they have the illegal status.
Yeah. So the centerpiece of this bill is really a provision that allows people to get, as people like to say, on the right side of the law. They can get a legal status that allows them to live and work and travel and all of those things. As you mentioned, though, a separate way to get to citizenship if that's what they choose, but they can also just stay and live, as you said, with a legal status in the United States. Does it also work for their family members, or how does that work?
The family members would have their own pathway.
Okay.
Legally. We're talking about the individuals who are present and who have been here for more than 5 years.
Yeah.
No less.
So you also mentioned that the bill deals with the border and with reforms to legal immigration as well. Tell us about some of those provisions and why you think that what you propose are the right ways.
Sure, legal immigration. The problem with this country, and for those who are listening, and most people don't know, that the legal immigration system, it's also broken. Why is it broken? Because we have pathways, we have lanes that are clogged, let's call it that way. So, you get on that lane and you just don't get to the finish line. It takes years and years and years. So if you have a business owner that needs a STEM talent, someone that knows how to put together molecules, I don't know. It doesn't matter. If you need it, you need them. And he needs to come in and start working Monday morning. You will not be able to get that person with that type of instruction, that type of knowledge. Then we're losing the future Albert Einsteins. Mm-hmm. They could be going to China or to Turkey or to Canada or to Europe. How do you think this country is going to grow and work and be able to continue being the number one economy in the world if we don't have the future Albert Einsteins coming into our country? Mm-hmm. Simple. So that's what I'm doing. I mean, I'm just the immigration pathways, I'm unclogging them. I'm making them work faster, and I'll give you the details later. But that's basically the concept. Yeah. If you need the person and you cannot find an American worker that will provide those talents, then bring them from Turkey or China or Russia or Ukraine or Uganda. It doesn't matter. We need the talent.
Yeah. So going back to the dignity program,
yes.
What sets this apart from previous legalization or other proposals? You mentioned at the top that you looked back at what had been done before and sort of put it in the blender. What makes this substantively different from other proposals in the past to deal with the undocumented population?
Well, that's a very good question. I don't want to be tooting my own horn. I think that we just struck the right balance between those who are between the border, those who live here legally, those who need to come in legally. So it's like the perfect mix. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Unfortunately, previous efforts, for instance, the bill that we just passed is a GOP, border security. Sure, we need border security. We need border security. But then what else? Can we walk and chew gum at the same time? Mm-hmm. I mean, we can seal the border, of course, with the best technology, more border patrol agents, more immigration agents, everyone and their mothers to work for us. But then what do you do with those STEM engineers that the business owner in Oklahoma needs? And what about the long lines? And what about the illegals who have lived here for 20 years? Mm-hmm. So it's all together. And I'm sure that we have the best product.
Yeah. So you mentioned that the House of Representatives has already passed a border bill. It was a party line Republican bill. And
where's the Senate?
Well, I was going to say that. I mean, some in the House have said we've done our part. We're done with immigration now. How do you see your bill moving? Do you think that your bill now has the opportunity, because the Senate needs to move something, as you mentioned, no bill gets enacted unless both the House and the Senate pass it and the president signs it. What's the process now for the Dignity Act in your sense?
Well, we are, the Senate is a little bit slower. We're working and talking to 3 key senators in the GOP. I'm sure that you know that Senator Coons on the Democratic side knows about the bill, likes it, and is willing to work with my colleagues on my side of the aisle. And I'm sure that we're making some good inroads with 3 different senators. And I'm sure that we will find a sponsor very soon. And then it's in God's hands. I always say that we do the possible and the Almighty does the impossible.
Yeah.
I'm not the Almighty. I leave that up to him.
Yeah. Fair enough. I think that's a good place for all of us to be. So in what ways do you think your bill complements or maybe contradicts what the Biden administration has done on immigration?
The Biden administration hasn't done anything. They haven't done anything. And they had a big opportunity in the first 2 years of the president to pass something. They did not need me.
Yeah, Democrats had the majority in both the House and the Senate.
They had the majority in the House, in the Senate, in the White House.
Yeah.
Bingo.
And they couldn't get it done.
And how come they didn't do anything? They passed infrastructure, they passed the BBB, they passed this, they passed that, but they didn't pass immigration. Really? Why is that? I don't know. If Democrats always say that they are here to support the DACA and the Dreamers and the Hispanics and the Browns, and it's all, I'm going to leave the adjectives to you. Empirical evidence is that empirical evidence shows that for the last 37 years, this topic has not been dealt with specifically by the Democrats, who have promised and promised and promised my community path to citizenship. Yeah. So the problem here is the dichotomy between all or nothing. It's either path or stay in the shadows. So I say, no, wait. We don't want a path and we don't want the shadows. We want the middle.
Yeah.
Because I'm going to tell you, I represent them and I know them and I belong to them. If you tell a Guatemalan or Hondurans or a Bolivian, I'm going to give you dignity and I'm not going to give you path, and you do not have to I don't want you to become an American. He's going to go like, okay. I like being a Bolivian, a Honduran, and a Guatemalan. I am proud, but I'm also proud that I'm part of the United States, the promised land. I'm contributing with the economy, and I can go back home and bury my mother.
So we are the Bipartisan Policy Center. So I do have to mention that Republicans had House, Senate, and White House a couple of times in those 30 years, and also didn't get their bills across either. And President Trump had it for a while as well. But so we believe that you need both sides.
Bush,
yeah.
No, of course. But, I'm going to tell you now that you're saying that they're Republicans. Bush, he tried perfect understanding with President Fox from Mexico to do what they call the whole enchilada, right?
Yeah.
And then what happened? 9/11.
Yes.
And
I remember it very well.
Died.
Yeah.
Yes, that's one chance.
Yeah.
Number 2, with President Trump, he put all his political capital in passing the tax law. He couldn't fight both fights.
Yeah.
I'm sure second term, well, he lost. He lost the Senate. I mean, he lost the Congress in his what usually happens 2 years into office, and then he couldn't do it. But the thing is that the GOP has not promised during the last 40 years immigration and all those big promises to the Hispanics as the Democrats. So that's why I'm always finding blame in them and saying, you promised, you got to deliver. We haven't promised so much. Now is when I'm coming in with a dignity, promising dignity to you.
Yeah. So, you touched on this. The landscape of immigration policy in the U.S. has changed, I think, quite a bit. And as I mentioned at the top, we haven't seen real comprehensive bipartisan legislation that, as you said, deals with the whole enchilada. I think 2013, 2014 was the last time we saw that kind of a bill. Why do you think it's so difficult in Congress to see that right now?
Well, I don't know, because I have no idea why my colleagues don't see what I see. Maybe because I come from the private sector.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe because I come from the world, because I belong to that culture. I speak the language. I have served them. I know what they're thinking. This is the largest minority in the country. But unfortunately, because of the different culture and the different language, maybe things get lost in translation.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm the one coming to my colleagues in the GOP and telling them, I know exactly what my community thinks.
Yeah.
Trust me.
So how are your colleagues in the Republican Party responding to the bill? I see you've gotten additional co-sponsors from both the Democrat side and the Republican side.
Yeah, we're working hard every day. We pick up one on each side every day.
We call it the
So
Noah's
we're
Ark path.
Gaining momentum.
Your Noah's Ark path, one from each side, right?
That's right. Well, that's what my staff tells me, that it's the most is the correct way of doing it. Right. So I'm following them.
Yeah. So that makes sure that you're getting support on both sides of the aisle to help move things forward. So as we come to the end of our time together, and I want to be respectful of your time and thank you again for joining us, are there any last things that you would like to share with the audience today on your views on immigration, on what Congress needs to do? What happens next?
This is a moral path. We as a country, the beacon of hope, the guardian of human rights and social liberties in the world, the best country that humanity has ever seen, cannot have a large number of people in the shadows. That's the number one aspect. Let's be morally correct. And number two, let's be economically correct. It's impossible to grow our economy, the number one in the world, if we don't have the hands that will provide those jobs that others do not want to perform. And we have millions of people in this country who are doing those jobs illegally. Mm-hmm. So if we sort of clean up the system, we give them the possibility of working legally, and at the same time do jobs that others don't want to, at the same time come in and import those who have the brains in order to create the new words, which are artificial intelligence and microconductors, all those things that you need in order to make the economy better, mm-hmm. Then how come we are curtailing ourselves or not giving us the opportunity mm-hmm. as a country to have that? Having the people wanting to come to the United States, because if you tell me, hey, we're giving you all the possibilities, but they don't want to come because we're China or Russia. But we have everything. We're closing the door on them. So that is irrational from the point of view of a country. So I think that it makes a lot common sense what I'm saying. Unfortunately, it's the least common of all senses. But it is common sense to have legal path, to legalize those who aren't here, seal the border, and from now on determine who comes in and who doesn't.
Well, Representative Salazar, I want to thank you so much for joining us on This Week in Immigration. We will follow the Dignity Act very closely and see what happens from here. But thank you again for joining us on the podcast.
Of course. And thanks to you for giving me the opportunity to tell the world what a wonderful product we have in our hands. And thanks again. May the Lord guide us.
Thank you very much, Congresswoman. Appreciate it.
We're going to take a quick break. And when we come back, we've got an exclusive one-on-one with Theresa as we celebrate our 150th episode. Don't go anywhere. We're back, and to commemorate the 150th episode of the podcast, we're going to reflect on past podcast episodes and share some highlights we've had along the way. I'm not the first person to host this podcast. I was preceded by Hannah Tyler.
Welcome back to This Week in Immigration. I'm your host, Hannah Tyler.
Blake Johnson.
I'm your host, Blake Johnson.
Rachel Iacono.
I'm Rachel Iacono.
Hunter Hallman.
I'm your host, Hunter Hallman.
And Jordan Lapierre.
I'm your host, Jordan Lapierre.
Lots of folks have helped support and make this podcast possible over the years. Joining us now to reflect on the labor of love that is This Week in Immigration is podcast creator and regular Theresa Cardinal Brown.
Hi, Hanadi.
It's great to have you here, and I'm excited to dive into this episode, Theresa. To kick off this conversation, why don't you tell us and the listeners a little bit about why you decided to start the podcast? Take us back to 2017. Tell me a little bit about the state of immigration and why you felt like there was a need and a space for a podcast like this.
Well, so we actually started with what we thought was going to be a short series of podcasts that we called What You Need to Know About Immigration. It was our season 0, if you will. And it was a short series of about 5 podcasts that we were just going to cover a different issue each podcast. And part of this was because when President Trump was elected, he obviously made immigration a centerpiece of his campaign and a centerpiece of his administration. And we had a lot more people paying attention to immigration who hadn't paid attention to it before. And so there were a lot of things that were in the news that people didn't have a lot of background on. So we said, okay, why don't we just do basically some explainer podcasts? BPC was experimenting with the podcast format, and our little immigration team at BPC has always been one to like, hey, let's try new things. We can be nimble. We can do this. I personally have been a podcast listener for a very long time, like maybe 20 years. So like the idea of doing my own podcast was also kind of exciting for me because I've listened to podcasts so much. So yeah, that's why we started it. The first one was just our first host, Jordan Lapierre, and me. And each episode he would ask me some questions and I would break down DACA or legal immigration or what's going on at the border. And we thought that this was stuff that people who follow BPC would want to hear about. So yeah, that was our very first one.
Today's conversation is the first in a series we're doing this year on immigration issues. And today I'm joined by Theresa Cardinal Brown. She's the Director of Immigration and Cross-Border Policy here at BPC. Thanks for being here.
Thanks, Jordan. Nice to be here.
So before we get into it, remember you can find us on Twitter at BPC_bipartisan or on Facebook at Bipartisan Policy Center. Leave us your thoughts on either of those mediums, and we would love to get back to you and start a conversation. So, Theresa, today we're going to talk a little bit about Dreamers, DACA.
Well, as we all know, a lot of podcasts die a silent death. They'll release episodes and then one day, sort of wordlessly, they just stop, but not this podcast. So what, in your view, has made this podcast so successful?
Well, yeah, I mean, the term in podcasting circles is pod fading, when you just sort of stop recording any new episodes and you have your catalog back out there. But, people kind of wonder, oh, what happened? Why'd they go away? Having had a lot of podcasts that I listened to do that to me over the years, I was kind of determined not to do that. Like if and when it's time for This Week in Immigration to wrap up, I want to make sure that we let everybody know why and when, and we do that. But I'm hoping it doesn't happen for a while. I think maybe it was my determination not to pod fade. So that every time we sort of hit a wall or we're like, oh, we have a change in hosts or a change of topic, or let's rethink how we want to do the podcast, I was very determined that no matter what, we would really try to keep it going. And to do a regular podcast, to have a consistent release schedule is not easy. I mean, as well as I do, behind the scenes, we have to figure out what the topics are and invite guests and schedule that and write a script. And then, we have our editors, different editors over the years that have worked on sort of making it sound good for everybody. Maybe it's just that I'm dogged in making sure that we keep doing this. You do take some breaks, usually at the end of the year. BPC closes for a couple of weeks. And so we'll say, hey, maybe mid-December, like, okay, this is our last one for the year. We'll see you again in January. So we do take some time off. But yeah, I think that's been the reason. And frankly, we have not run out of things to talk about in the immigration space at all.
Yeah, I don't imagine there'll ever be a shortage of issues to discuss anytime soon. Well, I wasn't here in 2017 when you all started the podcast, but with any big endeavor like this, I imagine there was a lot of growing pains and learning curves. So paint me and our listeners a picture. What were things like then, and how have they changed and or improved since?
So in the early days, we recorded everything live in person. We have a little tiny podcast studio here at BPC. And so BPC had invested in some digital recording equipment and some mics. And so we would all sit around, literally crammed into this tiny studio, hoping that we didn't have a lot of people walk by the door outside or make noise, that, we could deal with it. We tried not to do a lot of stopping and editing. We did, record straight through if we could. We didn't have music. We didn't have bumpers. We just sort of said, okay. And we didn't really have scripts. We had sort of okay, here's the topics we're going to talk about and some questions. And then those of us who are going to be on the podcast, we'd write, make sure we had our notes in front of us so we knew what we were going to say. But it was a little seat of your pants, I would say, in the early days. And over time, we've kind of upped the production value. When COVID hit, obviously, that was a big problem for us initially because we had been used to recording in studio. We all had to record on our home equipment, and not many of us had good quality home mics because we weren't recording podcasts at home. So those first few episodes in 2020, I think were, maybe not up to the quality level, but over time, I know I invested in a better mic at home and headphones, and we were recording on Teams or we were recording on our phones individually, and then that was a bigger editing job for our editors because then we had separate audio streams that they had to edit together. People had to email these large audio files to our editors to be able to sync that up. So that was an issue sometimes in just trying to get, especially if we had outside guests on, trying to get that from somebody outside BPC into our system. But, we over time discovered ways to deal with that. We now record on a web-based platform that allows everybody to record separately. So investing in some other technologies that help us be able to do it virtually. And virtual recording also allows us to continue to have great guests on because they don't have to trek all the way to the BPC studios to be on. So, yeah.
Over the course of 150 episodes in 6 years, what moments stand out to you? You've had a ton of guests on, so maybe without playing any favorites, why don't you share with us some of your favorite moments and interviews throughout the years?
Yeah, so I would have to say, the first episode when we shifted from What You Need to Know About Immigration to This Week in Immigration, that was kind of a big deal because we were committing to a regular podcast. And, we really called it This Week in Immigration. We tried very hard early on to do a weekly podcast, but that was really hard. So we ended up doing every 2 weeks, and that's the schedule we've kept since then. But we kept the name This Week in Immigration because it just sounds better than every other week in immigration. But so here's a clip from that very first episode.
This week we're talking about DACA and Dreamers, extreme vetting and the travel ban, and sanctuary cities and interior enforcement.
The deadline for DACA recipients to get one last 2-year renewal of their status under that program has now passed. And that means the clock starts ticking for Congress to take action before the program expires next March.
So as I already mentioned, that episode was released in the summer of 2017. Trump was elected. Immigration was a big topic. It was just 4 of us in the studio. It was Jordan Lapierre, Hunter Hallman, myself, and Chris Ramon, who was our senior policy analyst at the time. And those first episodes, it was just the 4 of us every week. We just come in, and Jordan and Hunter would trade off asking questions of Chris and I, or Chris would have a topic and I'd have a topic. And we just covered the news of the day. We tried to do it at a level that people had an interest in immigration, but maybe weren't as, really in the weeds as we are. So I call it the informed wonk level, right? Somebody who wants to be knowledgeable and understand things more, but maybe doesn't have the level of detail. So, we made sure to define terms and try not to use so many acronyms and that kind of stuff. And I think that's really the tone that we've tried to keep over the years. We've had now, we're 150 episodes. So we had a few other anniversaries. We had our 50th anniversary episode. That was a couple of years later. And again, not thinking this thing was going to last, 50 was huge for us. So we celebrated that. And here's a clip.
On the program this week, it's our 50th episode. We'll take a step back from breaking news to reflect on the history of America's immigration debate and how we found ourselves in the current moment.
And then I think after a while, we wanted to kind of change things up. Again, we'd had some personnel changes at BPC, and we tried to see what we could do to kind of address different seasons of the year. So one of the things we thought up of was doing a special Thanksgiving episode. And this came about because we had some people who were immigrants themselves working for us at the time. And in talking with them about, what are you going to do over Thanksgiving? We realized that Thanksgiving is a very American holiday, right? It's not something that's celebrated around the world. And if you come from an immigrant family, kind of understanding the Thanksgiving traditions and adopting that for your own culture and that sort of mix and match, Thanksgiving also is a time period where families get together, and American families may have some struggles talking about difficult issues like political issues. And BPC had started a couple of years before that, putting out these kind of Thanksgiving placemats with how to talk to your family about political issues. So we thought it would be a good idea to do that. So Sadiksha Nepal, who was our immigration fellow at the time, who's an immigrant herself, talked a little bit about her Thanksgiving traditions and sort of acculturating that. And, we also talked to some folks who work hard on the issues of how do you talk about immigration. We talked to Rachel Perrick from Welcoming America one year. We talked to Wendy Felice from the Center of Inclusion and Belonging another year. But here's a clip from that first Thanksgiving episode.
So my family arrived when I was 16, and my father actually was a recipient of the diversity visa lottery. So we arrived it was me, my father, my mother, and my brother. So 4 of us came together in 2004.
And what did you do your first Thanksgiving in the United States? Do you remember that?
So because you want to make the turkey, you want to kind of participate. And I think the driving force was probably my brother and I, who were like, we should do Thanksgiving. It's fun. So we did make turkey, not the stuffing and anything, because you don't know the whole the sides and stuff. That was years in learning that you eat mashed potatoes and stuff like that. I didn't know any of that. So the first Thanksgiving, I would say that it was just turkey. And then rice, because South Asians, we eat a lot of rice. So it was very bland. And I think that has pretty much dissuaded my parents from eating turkey forever. So they're not big turkey people. They did not enjoy it, as many immigrants can, I think, say that. So yeah, I think it was when we were 16, when we had first arrived.
I think the other things that strike out to me, obviously in the summer of 2020, there was a lot of reckoning with racial issues in the United States, and immigration is linked up with that in many ways. And so we invited Alan Orr, who is an African-American immigration attorney. He was then the president-elect of the American Immigration Lawyers Association, to talk to us about some of the racial roots of our immigration system, particularly the experience of Black immigrants in the United States. And how that intersected with the broader racial issues. And I think that was a really important episode for us to do. Alan brought great perspective, and it was important for us to address it at that time.
The first thing when you think of an immigrant, you don't think of someone who's Black. So that's the first overreaching challenge. And then on top of that, we have this big social justice issue that is surrounding all the United States, whether you're immigrant or not immigrant. And so when a person of color is stopped, the first question that isn't asked is their immigration status, because of the enforcement procedures that happen in all of the Black communities around the country. So over-policing, the tension-building police, and sort of enforcement is everywhere. And so that's why a large number of Black immigrants get caught up in deportation, because they live in these over-policed societies. And that leads to a greater proportion of Africans and Black people and Caribbeans being deported from the United States.
And then again, our next big anniversary episode was our 100th anniversary episode, our 100th episode. And, we were able to get a bunch of our previous hosts who no longer were at Bipartisan Policy Center, but were kind enough to record kind of congratulations for us. And Jordan Lapierre, who was our first podcast host and press secretary here at BPC, recorded this little clip talking about the intentions behind the podcast at the beginning.
I think so. I mean, it was my job to always say, can we make it simpler? Can we make it easier to understand? Can we frame these questions in a way that break down the core issues? Like, how do we avoid covering too much ground or assuming our listeners know too much? I'm really proud of what we were able to do in making these complicated things a little bit simpler.
Another great moment was when we first had our first member of Congress guest star on the podcast. Representative Zoe Lofgren from California, a Democrat from California, came on to talk about a bill on the immigration courts. And we'd been talking about immigration courts and immigration court backlogs for quite a long time on the podcast. as it related to the arrival of asylum seekers. So this was a great opportunity to kind of get a sense from a member of Congress how they thought about this issue and a little bit of the thinking behind immigration and immigration bills and why it's so hard to get passed. So here's a little snippet of what she had to say on our podcast.
Really, the foundation for our legal system is respect for the rule of law. And fundamental to the rule of law is that it's impartial, that judges will make decisions based on the law and the facts, not on political influence or any other factor. And so this is really important, not just for immigrants, but for American society, to have a legal system that we can respect, that we know is independent, that we know is apolitical. That's really important. And it's something that we expect in every courtroom in America. This should be no different.
So I think longtime listeners of the podcast know that we've covered quite a bit of immigration litigation. We created this segment called The Gavel, where we talk about it. And we just had an episode a couple episodes ago where we talked about some Supreme Court decisions. But when the Supreme Court ruling that overturned Roe v. Wade came out, obviously that's not an immigration decision specifically, but one of the things we thought about is the possible implications for that of other seminal decisions that do affect immigration. So we invited a couple of attorneys on to talk about that. And there's a major Supreme Court decision called Plyler v. Doe, which was a 1982 decision that in which the Supreme Court said that all immigrant children, including undocumented immigrant children, were entitled to public school education in the United States, free public school education. And so we asked Melissa Lazaran from Migration Policy Institute her thoughts about whether or not the Roe v. Wade decision might have implications should Plyler v. Doe be challenged again. So this is what she had to say.
Secondly, Plyler has been critical in safeguarding access to education for immigrants in general. Through the immigrant backlash of the 90s, where states like California sought to put in place laws excluding unauthorized immigrants from public schools, that was easily overturned and was claimed unconstitutional because of Plyler.
We've had a lot of BPC staff on the podcast over the years, sometimes immigration staff, sometimes staff from other project areas that have issues related to immigration, our economic policy team, our healthcare team. But really special to me was when Nina Ladonio, who is currently our corporate relations manager here at Bipartisan Policy Center, she's a DACA recipient. And we had years of talking about DACA on the podcast. And Nina and I had conversations before she came on the podcast about her status and things like that. And I asked her, would you be willing to come on and talk about it? And I think a lot of DACA recipients, she was probably initially reluctant to kind of be publicly acknowledge her status. But she kind of got to the point, as many people have done, of at this point, I don't have anything to lose. I need to talk about it. And she came and shared her personal story and how the back and forth of her DACA and its uncertain status has affected her and her family. And just, seeing her, one, be brave enough to do that, and two, sharing her personal story, I think was a real highlight for me on the podcast. So here's Nina talking about DACA.
To start, I've been on the program since it started in 2012. So that's 10 years on the dot. I renewed last year. And so it's just been a part of my life for 10 years, the routine of having to make sure the application goes in, making sure that you're up to date. But overall, it's had some of those, having to stay on top of that whole thing. You have to prove all these things. You have to show proof that you've arrived in the U.S. before the age of 16 as a kid. And there's all these requirements. I think there's 7 of them listed on the USCIS website. So that on top of being in the program for 10 years is already a lot of boxes to check as you pull your first or your fifth or your sixth, seventh, eighth application together, if those of us on the fifth get a sixth and seventh.
And then I mentioned that we had tried to do some holiday related episodes. So last year for Valentine's Day, we thought, there's this mythology around marrying an American to get immigration status. We thought that would be a great topic for a Valentine's Day episode. So we invited Jeremy McKinney, who is president of the American Immigration Lawyers Association and has done a lot of immigration cases for couples that are married, to come on and play a little bit of fact or fiction, based on sort of the Hollywood movie myths about marrying for a green card. And that was great fun. He was real game for this, and I really enjoyed that episode. So here's Jeremy doing fact or fiction. Government interviews for suspected marriage fraud include asking couples about the color of their spouse's toothbrush, what side of the bed they sleep on, the color of the curtains in the bedroom, or other details. Fact or fiction?
That is almost entirely fact. And let me clarify, immigration tends to ask questions that have objective answers. So, for example, I've been practicing for 25 years. I've never had an immigration adjudicator ask, what is your partner's favorite food?
Okay.
Because that is a subjective. You would not ask that. What you would ask is, what was the last meal you ate together and what did you eat? Right? You see the difference there. It goes from subjective to objective.
Okay, so we've talked about some of the highlights over the years, but what were maybe some less favorable moments, some of the biggest challenges in producing the podcast that you've experienced?
Well, I already talked about sort of the transition in COVID when we all had to start recording from home. I think that was a very scary time for me because I wasn't sure that we'd be able to continue recording and getting episodes out on a regular basis. Every time we have a personnel change here at BPC, it's like, okay, who can I'm consistently here. I've been here 9.5 years. And, if I don't go anywhere, we can keep doing this forever. But, we've had changes of hosts, as you mentioned, Hanadi. We've had changes in our audio editing and who's available to help with that. And just sort of, I have to give a shout out to the Bipartisan Policy Center leadership who have been willing, particularly our communication staff, who've been willing over the years to just let our little thing keep going, right? And have supported us along the way. Every time we get somebody from outside BPC on the podcast trying to, the 15 minutes at the top trying to get all the technology right. And, does their audio sound good?
Oh, I know.
Can they hear us? Can we hear them? The hiccups we had sort of getting the audio files from people when they were recording on their own devices and then had to send it to us. And, if they didn't get it in on time, could our editor rush and edit the episode, getting the episodes out on time and making sure we hit that every 2-week mark. We've missed it a couple of times, but, the hallmark of a good podcast is one that can be consistent. So that's something I've been really pushing on. Getting guests on, sometimes there's been a last minute scramble. Oh my goodness, we're supposed to record this week. What do we talk about? And then it's like, oh, we have to, do we have it? Or we ask a guest and then they don't get back to us and they're like, yep, I can record tomorrow. And suddenly, oh, we've got to do that. I mean, I think anybody who produces any sort of media will recognize all of those hiccups, right?
Yeah.
Hanadi, you deal with a lot of television and radio producers that are looking to get BPC guests on. And there's a lot of sort of last minute, we need somebody now. Can they come? And, so that's, I think, some of the drama behind the scenes that we try not to let on too much because it's all supposed to flow very smoothly. This is just, it just all happens miraculously. But yeah, there are times when it's stressful behind the scenes.
Well, to your earlier point, I always say it wouldn't be a This Week in Immigration episode if we didn't have at least one little tech issue in the beginning. So it's like every guest's induction into the podcast. I might be biased, but I think our podcast name really has a ring to it. So how did you come up with it?
So I mentioned at the beginning, we had really hoped to have a weekly podcast.
Yeah.
That just became a little too hard for us to do on a regular basis because guess what? We do other things at Bipartisan Policy Center than record this podcast. So we went to every 2 weeks. But we were looking for, sort of, I didn't want anything too cutesy. We wanted it to sound newsworthy because one of our goals was to try to keep up with the news, right? So, we try to be relevant to what's happening in the news, what people are reading, give them a little bit more depth than they may get from a short article that they're seeing or a story they're seeing on TV. And so we wanted to sound a little newsy. I think back to the great news reporting TV shows that were this week, or, that kind of stuff. I think that's, it had a little bit of a ring to it. We had to have the word immigration in there so people knew what we were talking about. I guess it's easy to Google, but, it just kind of rolls off the tongue a little bit. So I think that was the thinking. And frankly, none of us had any better ideas.
Well, I'm glad this one won out. Well, we hear a lot in our conversations with various folks, reporters, Hill staff, policy wonks, that they listen to and they love the podcast. We've even had some of those folks on our podcasts. When did you start hearing this kind of feedback? And as someone who created this project and stuck with it as its various supporting staff have cycled in and out, how do those comments make you feel?
I'm always amazed. I don't know why. I guess, like I said, this is the little podcast that could. Like I said, I've been a fan of other podcast producers for a long time. I never thought I would really be on one and do one on a regular basis, not much less one that has, over 1,000 downloads an episode and, from all around the world. And you're right. People reach out to me on LinkedIn. Hey, students and people in other organizations, people in government. We've had staff from Capitol Hill reach out to us to help, asking about a particular piece of legislation their boss wants to do and tell us, oh, I came to you because of your podcast. As you mentioned, reporters have listened to our podcast and told us that they like it, and then subsequently reach out to have me on there. And I love those episodes, by the way, when we have the reporters on, because then I get to interview them, which is always great fun. They're not used to being interviewed.
Turn the tables on them.
I get to turn the tables on them, and it's so much fun. And I think they enjoy it as well. So, and it's been a way for us to kind of help with those relationships with a lot of media folks. But yeah, I still kind of get a little embarrassed about it. I was at a conference over the weekend with members from the National Association of Counties, and I was in the hallway talking to somebody else, and somebody stopped and said, I know your voice. You're that podcast lady from immigration. And I was like, that's the first time that had ever happened, where somebody heard my voice and said, oh, I know who that is. So I would say I'm a little still kind of embarrassed about it a little bit, but happy for the podcast itself, right? Like for me, I didn't, I'm not necessarily out here seeking celebrity. That's not my point. We always hoped that the podcast would do what it's doing, which is help people understand the policy arena where immigration is, break down these stories, understand the back end of things, get behind the slogans or the bumper stickers or the sound bites. And, immigration's complicated. It's not that simple an issue. And so to the extent we can help people understand it, help them formulate informed opinions about immigration, let various voices in the debate be heard, then I think that's what we really are trying to do. And when people tell us that's what's happening, then yay, we've met our goal.
Yeah. Well, we're wrapping up this milestone episode with a great guest and more episodes to come. What is your hope or vision for the podcast for the next few years? Where are you hoping it goes?
That's a really good question. At the moment, I'm just, we kind of do a lot of week to week, episode to episode. But, I enjoy doing this. I hope that we can continue doing this in some form, in some way. I've been lucky enough to have a home here at BPC for almost 10 years now. So, if this podcast can stay here and have a home and people are still willing to work with me to keep it going, I think that's the most I can hope for. We've been lucky to get some great guests on, and I hope we can continue to do that. And, I'd love to hear from the listeners what we could do that they would be interested in listening to that we haven't done yet. So, so that's what I'm hoping to do.
Yeah. Well, to our listeners, if you have suggestions, you can email us at immigration@bipartisanpolicy.org. Thank you, Theresa, for taking the time to reflect and celebrate all of the wonderful milestones the podcast has hit over the years. And to all the people who support the podcast, our listeners, guests, BPC staff, both past and present, Thank you. This podcast wouldn't be possible without you. Until next time. One last reminder to subscribe, rate, and review this podcast on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, or your favorite podcast platform, and share it with your friends and colleagues. You can also find more information on all of the issues we discuss here on the show at bipartisanpolicy.org/immigration. You can follow the Bipartisan Policy Center on Twitter at BPC_bipartisan. You can follow Theresa Cardinal Brown at BPC_T Brown. Send your comments and feedback to us at immigration@bipartisanpolicy.org. I'm Hanadi Jordan. This Week in Immigration was created and executive produced by Theresa Cardinal Brown. This week's episode was written by Hanadi Jordan, Theresa Cardinal Brown, Jack Malday, and Dia Roy. Joshua Joe is our audio editor. The executive producer of BPC Podcasts is Lucy Manning. See you next time on This Week in Immigration.